good morning. So I have with me a few of my colleagues from Gale, that's the Global Alliance of Impact Lawyers. They're from Legance Legal, and I'm really happy to have them. They're calling in from Italy. Where are you guys in Italy?
We are in Milan.
You're in Milan, yes. It's a Friday for them, and I really appreciate them spending a bit of time with me on their afternoon to tell us about the EU regulatory framework on ESG. So I have Roberto Randazzo and Fabio Gallo Perozzi. And I don't think I butchered their names, but I'm sure I didn't pronounce them properly. So I appreciate you guys coming
It's
on
almost
and
perfect. It's
letting me
almost
butcher your
perfect.
names for a bit. So as I said, thank you so much for coming on. We know each other through the Global Alliance of Impact Lawyers. It's a really wonderful network of lawyers doing this, and it gives us the opportunity to share learnings from around the world. It's particularly useful in the context of ESG because there's so many developments in the EU in this space that we have a lot to learn from our colleagues in Europe. And so I really appreciate you guys coming on today and
Well,
telling us a
thank you
bit
for
more
this
about the framework.
invitation. Thank you so much.
It is a
Before we
pleasure.
before we start, getting into the nitty-gritty of the law, I'd love to just learn a little bit about the two of you. So perhaps first, Roberto, can you tell me a little bit about your background and how you got into this ESG practice?
Yeah, let me start from my own practice. I'm engaged in the ESG and impact field, which is a very well structured field here in the EU. Probably you know, and this is part of our discussion today. We received a lot of piece of legislation in the last 5 years about that. And I was born as a corporate lawyer, but in the years I moved to the S pillar of the SG, supporting social entrepreneurship, sustainable finance, and transnational activities linked to international cooperation. So this is my background before moving to the ESG regulation. Here at Legance, this is an Italian independent law firm. I run the ESG and impact practice that has been set up 3 years ago. Uh, Together with me, Fabio.
Yes, I started my journey 5 years ago when I met Roberto as a lawyer, and right now I'm having a lot of fun in deepening all these regulatory aspects that we will probably discuss today. We will see how much the EU regulatory framework has evolved. And I'm also collaborating with Politecnico of Milan, and a university, as Roberto is an assistant teacher there. So we are also having an academic background that is helping us in our journey.
So it
And
sounds
just
like
to
Roberto, did you have a career that was less focused on ESG for the first part of your career, and then you were able to shift into ESG areas once more regulations came about, whereas Fabio, most of your career seems to have focused on these kind of impact issues?
Yeah, more or less yes, because I mean it was too early to me to
Yeah,
be aligned with the SG field because it was not
there
existing
was none.
before.
Yeah. Yeah.
But let me say that being linked to the social entrepreneurship and sustainable finance pioneeristic approach, and having clients involved in that field, I started more than 10 years ago to be close to the now called ESG field.
That
And
makes
let
sense. You were working with impact investors and social entrepreneurs, companies and investors that had a mindset about environmental or social impact, but there wasn't as much of a sophisticated body of law for you to work with. You were one of the first ones helping to develop it.
Yeah, this is exactly the point, and this is the same reason why 12 years ago I was engaged by a very small group of lawyers, European lawyers, to set up the European Social Entrepreneurship Law Association. This was the origin of GALE, Global Alliance of Impact Lawyers. At
Yeah.
that time, the name of that organization was linked more to the social enterprise perspective than to the sustainability or ESG profile. And GALE was origined by that first organization. Esela. So let me say, Patrick, coming back to your introduction, we had the chance to witness the innovative approach to ESG coming from a different experience, the one related to social entrepreneurship. And this is what happened in Europe in some way. The pillar, the cornerstone of the system, of the actual system of ESG legislation, it is based on environmental law and social entrepreneurship legislation. So this is the origin of our legislation in the EU.
Yes, yeah, social entrepreneurship is such an important kind of feature. And I really think about it in terms of, so for instance, with this show and just in general, ESG is kind of an interesting catch-all term. It means a lot of different things to a lot of different people. For me, when I think of ESG and the law, I think of it more broadly as what are the responsibilities that companies have to society and the environment? And that's also what the social entrepreneur thinks of. They think of themselves as having responsibilities to society as well as to their stakeholder, their financial stakeholders. So it makes sense that we're kind of speaking all about these same issues around these same targets. Now, the interesting thing about ESG law is it affects kind of traditional businesses that don't necessarily have mission ingrained into their corporate documents, and it also affects these mission-driven businesses.
And Patrick, let me jump in just because you touched base on a very key issue that is liabilities, responsibilities. As you already know, here in Europe, we are experiencing really an evolution in the regulatory framework. And I think we might address it also sharing a slide that we prepared just to discuss a little bit about it.
Yes, yes, please do. I'm really happy that you brought the slide along because it gives a nice overview of the evolution. So I'll give you the floor for a little bit so you can tell us a little bit about the evolution in Europe of these laws.
I will leave the floor to Roberto just to introduce this regulatory framework, and then I would be very happy to deepen some aspects of the impact that it is having on our market and internationally also.
Yeah, let's move to a double-headed comment of this slide, this picture. This is the story of our EU legislation, and we started with the Non-Financial Reporting Directive 2014. And the reason why this blue box has a non-continuous red line is that this legislation has been retired because of the new legislation about corporate sustainability reporting. The Corporate Sustainability Reporting Directive took the place of that first legislation. And this is something to be considered in the meaning that you can understand, Patrick, that if you in less than 8 years you retire a legislation because it is too old and the technical approach to measurement it is not enough aligned with the new tools developed in the last 8 years. This means that the way the legislation has been developed, it represents a very strong approach for EU institutions. And starting from that first approach, the NFRD legislation, we had the first cornerstone of the system represented by Sustainable Finance Disclosure Regulation. This is a regulation for the financial operators, as the law expressly set out, and this is substantially a disclosure legislation. It is not a law to force financial operators into the sustainability field. It is a way to share information about their investments or their activities. Mm-hmm. This legislation for the first time created a sort of ladder to evaluate how a financial product it is aligned to ESG or sustainable profile. We do have the Article 6 products. These products are not aligned to sustainability. The Article 8 products are product ESG aligned with specific ESG characteristics, and the Article 9 products having a specific purpose to develop sustainability with
Yeah.
specific goal to drive sustainability in the financial process.
So as of 2019, 2020, companies don't yet have a responsibility or obligation to report, but if they are reporting or if they have a financial instrument that purports to have an environmental focus, this gives guidance and a year later a taxonomy on how to speak about the environmental social aspects of the investment, correct?
Exactly, because the sustainable finance disclosure regime is affecting especially the asset managers,
Yes.
but indirectly it has having a lot of impacts also on companies and the corporate sector. And indeed, it has been implemented just few years after, in 2022, with Directive on Corporate Sustainability Reporting. And this has been a huge step for the EU market, because in this way, the same kind of disclosure obligation have been imposed to the market, to the companies
So let's just take a
who are
beat.
invested.
So people often refer to this as the CSRD, right?
Exactly.
Yes, this is kind of the landmark piece of EU-wide legislation. And let me just ask, because I'm an American lawyer, is this an EU law and then every different jurisdiction like Italy has an implementing law to implement that law, or is it EU-wide and it doesn't require an implementing legislation?
Again, Patrick, you touch a very important issue, because the regulation on sustainable finance is a regulation, so it has a direct application in every country, every member state of the Union. Instead, the CSRD, as you called it, is a directive, so it has been implemented, for example, already in Italy through a national transposition act. And we are already experiencing the effects and impacts of this directive on the market.
But it
Oh,
is
can I
it's
just
relevant
pause for a
for.
second? So a regulation is kind of like a regulatory act from a regulatory body. So that's why it doesn't require a law, for instance. It's similar to kind of how we have the SEC. If an SEC passes a regulation, that applies because it's how the regulator is viewing an issue, let's say. Whereas a directive is something from the EU as a whole, the European Council. Am I right?
More or less, in the meaning that the regulation it is for all member states and it is to be executed in the same way in each jurisdiction.
Yeah. Whereas a
Directive,
directive, there's implementing legislation, so there's guidance on how each country
yeah.
can enacting laws, but there can be a little bit of differentiation between jurisdictions.
Yeah, but the heart of the directive it is the same.
Yes.
The differences are, just to give an example, related to liabilities or criminal law breaches, in the meaning that this is to be obviously developed accordingly to the local legislation, but the basis and the heart of the system it is the same. So the transposition it is just related to the ancillars application of the directive.
Understood, understood. So thank you. I appreciate that. So now we're in 2022. We're at the passing of the CSRD, the Sustainability Reporting Directive.
Yes, exactly. And just 1 year later, we have been experiencing a new step further. It has been adopted a regulation on the European Sustainability Reporting Standards. And this is a huge step to implement the CSRD, because, again, what the EU has set is a common way to report and comply with this directive. So the effect of this regulation is that every company shall now disclose the sustainability information according to the same reporting standards. But let me touch, Patrick, one very, very key issue, that is, we are not just speaking about reporting. This is very often misunderstood, because the CSRD, from our experience, is bringing to the table also some very important effects on the organizational model of companies, their governance, the liabilities of the company itself, and also the directives. And we're speaking and addressing this topic from both a civil and criminal law perspective. So very, very important effects
Could
on the market.
can you tell me a bit more about the criminal liabilities that are attached to the CSRD?
Yes, just to give you an example, a very basic one. Now, this kind of reporting is not a kind of report that will be put on the website online. It will be a key piece of the financial statements of companies. And
Hmm.
this already is bringing also criminal liabilities implications because, for example, under a criminal law perspective, false communication can be a breach of a criminal code. So, for example, this is the reason why signing this new sustainability reporting, it will be very, very important that every kind of information has passed through a kind of process to make sure it has been collected in the right way.
Yeah, okay, that's very very important. So you have director sign off on these reporting standards. So it makes it clear that it has whoever's reporting it up the chain has to make sure that what they're reporting is accurate. And then the ESRS give you a framework for of what needs to be reported on. Um,
Yeah, sorry, Patrick. More than a framework, ESRS do represent the specific KPIs to be embedded in the new financial statements in the part related to sustainability. Let just to better understand ESRS today, we received 1,700 KPIs. These are the so-called cross-cutting KPIs related to the governance of companies, to the strategic approach to sustainability, to their evaluation of the ESG risks, etc.
I'm sorry,
We
did you say that companies have to report on 1,700 different specific KPIs or only the KPIs that are relevant to their company?
No, they have to report all these KPIs, and some of them obviously could be considered not applicable, for instance. So, no problem to say, in this case, I cannot share information because I do not have any information, etc. But the most relevant point about the legal profile of these KPIs is that the application and the due diligence in order to fill the information related to SRS are strictly regulated by a legislative approach. In other words, ESG due diligence and the double materiality approach, it is to be run accordingly to the legislation. And
Yeah.
this is one of the hot topic for us being lawyers because it's the way to mitigate risks for board members or for the company, and in order to create a specific focus on the ESG risks according to this new legislation. And just to conclude, to give you a full picture about this ESRS, we are waiting for vertical and specific ESRS selected by industries. This means that each industry will receive specific ESRS, automotive, energy, etc., related to their approach to the market and to their activities. So, so it's a way. It is too complicated. I can understand. If you look at that from California, this could be the hell in some way. But let me say that if companies were aware, just to give an example, to the GRI principle, the ESRS in some way could be considered as a development of the GRI approach.
That's the
And
Global
so,
Reporting Initiative's approach to double
yeah,
materiality. Yeah.
yeah. So it's something different, more structured, more complicated, but the basis it is almost the same. So it's not, rocket science, and it's not so difficult to approach this
So I don't
new.
want to get into all 1,700 KPIs, but I wonder if there are a handful of kind of headings of topics that are reported on in the CSRD.
Yeah, it is divided essentially in three sectors, we might call it sections. First of all, the environmental aspect, and again the social aspects and the governance
Mm.
issues. And let me also say that companies will have to deal with this new kind of reporting based on a materiality assessment. This is one of the key elements of this reporting directive, because based on that assessment, they will understand which kind of information are relevant for that kind of companies and shall be disclosed. And at the same time, when we say that we should not address this directive only from a reporting point of view, to make this kind of assessment, companies are supposed to have due diligence processes to assess all these kind of risks and opportunities and understand which are material. And this has a huge impact on the business of each company. And let me also add one aspect, that is the extraterritoriality effect of this directive, and also of other legislation that we are addressing today, but especially of this one. So companies will be required to report also if they are non-EU company. That is supposed to happen later on, not right now. But at the same time, there is the possibility for companies that are part of multinational group to not report if, for example, and I'm simplifying here the concept, the group is doing this kind of report according to the EU principles and provisions. So this is a very important compliance matter.
So if it's a multinational that's already reporting in another jurisdiction, they don't have to do a separate report?
Yeah, it is, and it is possible to recall the statement run by a non-EU based company if this statement is aligned to the EU principle, obviously not to the specific technical tools and KPIs as the SRS, but the principle in general.
Mm.
And this is something we are dealing with. I mean, assisting and advising EU companies or Italian companies being part of a multinational group today, in these weeks. I mean, we are dealing with this specific request. Is it the financial report we will receive next year aligned to the EU principle or not? So what do we have to do in order to be compliant with the EU legislation, considering that, generally speaking, the information from that kind of financial statement and sustainability statements could be not aligned to the EU legislation. So this is, the tricky point we are dealing with in these weeks, in order to understand under a multinational perspective if it runs for the EU legislation.
Yeah, because companies have been issuing sustainability reports for a number of years now. And so now the point is there are hard law standards that have to govern exactly what needs to be in that report. And so now you as lawyers have to advise on exactly whether or not the reports are adherent
Yeah.
to the laws that are relevant. So particularly the CSRD.
Exactly, and being a new directive, there is also a lot of uncertainties on how to apply it, and liabilities that we commented before. And if I may jump to another very important new here in Europe, it has been developed also the directive on empowering consumer in 2024. This is again a huge step, because in a kind of way it's empowering consumers in controlling and ensuring that companies are addressing these risks and opportunities related to ESG in the correct way, and avoiding greenwashing. That is the main problem that the EU Commission is addressing right now with all these kind of regulations and laws. But I think the most important one is the Corporate Sustainability Due Diligence Directive. This is very, very new. It was emanated just a few months ago. And what kind of impacts here? Well, of course, we are not dealing anymore with reporting obligations, but due diligence principles and provisions. And again, this is a kind of general framework, but we should look at this as an act of law implemented also with other secondary tools. And I'm referring, for example, to the EU deforestation regulation and other important laws on due diligence. So it's a very complex system that is shaping around due diligence standards related to the ESG matters.
Mhm. Yeah, no, this particularly in the business and human rights community, the CS Triple D has been, uh, you know, quite important in this field because it lays out a series of requirements for human rights due diligence. It's basically you have the reporting directive, which requires the reporting, and then the CS Triple D, the due diligence directive, sets out how you're supposed to conduct your due diligence such that you can fill in the reports. How do you go about the inquiry that you're going to be feeding into the reports?
Yeah, the two directives are strictly linked in the meaning that the approach to the ESG due diligence come from the CSRD,
Hmm.
but the way to develop it related to the value chain perspective, it comes from the CS Triple D.
Yeah.
And let me say that the basis of this due diligence, which is, I mean, uh, it's needed to be aligned with in order to better shape liabilities and protect with a specific mitigation tool the role of board members. It is to be implemented by the approach to the CS Triple D because the directive specifically provide the way to set a relationship along the whole value chain. This means supply chain and relationship with market, consumers, etc.
And
And
that's important for US lawyers because now we're going to have clients who have customers that are in the EU that are requiring a series of data points that we're
yeah.
going to have to advise on providing to the EU counterparts.
Yeah, this is the point. This is one of the perspective, and I fully agree with you. Being the consumer part of the value chain, it is to be embedded in this perspective, and the same approach it is to be considered on the supply chain with a supply chain perspective, in the meaning that starting from the raw material through the parts or component of the final product along the whole value chain, the relationship between supplier and producer it will be to be regulated accordingly to this legislation. So it's needed a specific due diligence, is needed a specific support to your supplier in order to align them to the legislation. It is specifically evaluated this perspective from the EU legislator in the meaning that this directive provides specific activities to elevate the approach or the alignment to the ESG profile of your suppliers. Just to give an example, Patrick, withdrawing from an agreement, it is the last chance of a negotiation with your supplier. So if you take the fast lane, withdrawing from these agreements, this is not correct according to this directive.
Yeah, we talk about it in terms we say irresponsible exit. You might be aware. So I've been involved with the Model Contract Clause project that addresses kind of template contracting in the human rights context and environmental reporting as well. But basically, a large kind of idea is that there's shared responsibility contracting where the buyer and the supplier both have responsibilities and part of the buyer's responsibility is to make it is to enable the supplier so that they can have the capacity to actually undertake the investigations to give you the information that you the buyer require for your reporting obligations or your due diligence obligations. So it's the idea you can't just as a buyer tell a supplier to give me some information, not give them any capabilities to actually retrieve the information and then just digest whatever the supplier comes up with. You have to actually have a shared approach to doing this so that it's actually effective.
Exactly, Patrick. And indeed, the directive on corporate sustainability due diligence is providing for an obligation also to address this kind of issues, publishing model clauses,
Hmm.
model contractual clauses that will help companies to deal with with these new kind of obligations. And we have been also involved as a working group
Oh, in the
on
European
setting
Model
up.
Contract Clause project?
Yeah,
Oh,
yeah.
Yeah,
fantastic.
We are part of that group.
Fantastic. Yeah. Yeah, I assumed
Roberto
I
is.
assumed you were. I assumed you were.
Yeah, yeah. And you know that this is something that we are also developing in our relationship, global relationship with other law firm. Just to give you an example, we are linked to a group of Latin American law firms. They started this project in order to share information with their clients about the CS-Triple-D because they took in strong consideration the role will be played by this legislation, and the other one is the deforestation Fabio was referring to before. And we created this group of law firm in order to inform and to, let me say, share the right approach to the legislation for non-EU companies supplying EU companies. As you can understand, being aligned with this kind of legislation, it will need time, and the directive has been approved last June. It will be implemented by in the next 2 years from June 2024. This means that on June 2026, this directive will come into force. And you know, shaping or reshaping your value chain, your supply chain, and the relationship there is not a fact of 2 or 3 months. So
Yeah, companies should use 2025 as a runway so that they could get their supply chains in line. And to your other point, that's very fascinating. I remember at the Gale conference in April there was a session with lawyers from the global South, particularly Latin America, to voice their concerns with respect to things like the CS Triple D and whether or not their clients in the global south are going to have the wherewithal to undertake all this reporting. Is it going to be a burden that's only taken on by the suppliers? And so that kind of addresses the point that we were just discussing, which is that
yeah,
buyers and suppliers both need to take on the cost burden, the technology burden, all of those burdens. They have to share them together. And so that's
it's
fascinating that you as lawyers are also enabling that sharing.
yeah, but it's a right perspective. I mean, I can understand the point. I fully agree with the approach. Having direct relationship with these colleagues, we understand the point. But let me say that the strong approach taken by the EU legislature, it is to be mitigated with different principles. Just to give you an example, we will receive a specific ESRS and KPIs for small and medium enterprises. We were referring to the different release we are receiving of this ESRS. This means that a specific ESRS will be made for small and medium enterprises having different approaches to this legislation in order to have lower cost to be aligned with the legislation, to have lower liabilities and impact on their structures, organizational structure to collect these ESG data. This means that it is not so strong, the application of this legislation for small and medium enterprises, just to give an example.
Yeah.
Or if we consider the timing, this will mean that you will have to start to be aligned with the legislation, and this will need time. And it is specifically provided by the legislation that some minimum requirements will be asked, and some provision cannot be compliant with a company. And there is a possibility to intervene in these cases, representing the points. But to better understand, another time is a way to disclose information. So if you disclose a risk related to an ESG profile, and you evaluate the possibility to manage with this specific risk to find out a way to solve the problem in the next 2, 3, 4, 5 years. This is the way the legislator is asking a collaborative approach from companies, more than saying, okay, you cannot go for that way because that's mining activity is not aligned for different reasons. So this is not the approach of the EU legislator.
That's a very important point. The idea is that the EU isn't requiring yet. So they're not requiring companies to stop mining activities, but they are saying, okay, you have to be honest about the impacts of this mining activity, and you have to have a plan for addressing those impacts over a number of years.
Exactly, and an example could be also the obligation to disclose if you have a transition action plan on climate change.
Hmm.
That is a very key important key aspect of these transparency obligations. And what we as lawyers are addressing is a best effort obligation. So again, it's not an obligation of a result, but what is required is the best effort to comply with these kind of objectives and targets.
And this best effort approach is relevant because it is the way to deal with specific risks that are not differently that cannot be differently managed, and you have to consider this transitional approach. It is something related to a way to address differently the strategy of EU companies about this specific point. Just to share another legal need related to sustainability, to the sustainability statement. Uh, if we consider as lawyer the financial statement, we consider a result of a year, and the figures, numbers in that financial statement represent the past activities of a company.
Okay.
It's not requested a budget for the next activities or for the next years. In this case, the information needed and requested by the EU legislation about the specific transitional point, it is about how can you, the legislator is asking to companies how you will deal with your transition to a cleaner activity, more related or linked more to the EU approaches. How do you are you going to plan your investments in order to drive these activities, etc. So it's a way to drive a strategic perspective to sustainability approach.
This has been really fascinating. This has been really helpful to have this overview of the framework and the evolution of the EU laws. I wonder if we could just spend a few minutes talking about how this has affected you as lawyers. So what type of legal advice are you doing with companies? How are you helping companies deal with the legal framework?
Um, we are in touch, obviously, with the US law firm, and we started from the financial side of this sustainability landscape.
Yeah.
Obviously, because the SFDR was the first regulation to put in place, and the relationship with US investor or asset manager, it was the first ring of this chain.
So making sure the financial statements were in order. So it was financial reporting, dealing with asset managers, things like that.
Yeah, or the activity, the investment activity here in the EU jurisdictions were perfectly aligned with the request coming from the SFDR. Although the SFDR was not for a US fund directly,
Yeah.
this is obvious. The second step and the second approach, it was to align companies, invested companies, portfolio companies of US asset manager, just to drive this example to the end, to the CSRD.
Yeah.
And and the CSRD information and ESG data coming from a CSRD perspective, driven into the financial statement and disclosure.
So
The
that's
third,
helping to align organizational change so that it comports with the regulation.
yeah, and this approach that could be better explained through a third example. the one that we were discussing before about the relationship between a EU company being part of a multinational company, US based, for
Yeah.
instance, it is specifically related to a double headed approach represented by a legal perspective. So, this is our job, and the ESG advisor support. So, we cannot deal with KPIs, measurement tools.
Yeah. That's
This is
not the
not
job
our
of
job.
lawyers
Yeah,
to
of
address all of
course. I
that.
mean, we can deal with the risks related to that approach,
Yeah.
but this double-headed approach drove us into this strong collaboration with the ESG advisor, and collaborating with a non-EU based law firm or consultants in general, and companies, of course. It's a job that it is to be run with this double-headed approach in order to let these companies understand that a sustainability statement or a sustainability report not based on the EU legislation, it is not enough.
Yeah.
So the EU-based company needs to be necessarily aligned with the EU legislation, cannot be leveraged by the US one. This is the point.
Mm.
And all this, Patrick, is also affecting M&A in such a way, an incredible way, as Legance is very often working with a US client, making investments in Europe and in Italy especially. What we are seeing is that the traditional M&A operation, where you are requested to implement a due diligence on the companies that you are acquiring, well, right now, what we are experiencing is a request to check and deal also with the compliance of the Italian companies, for example, with all these regulatory framework that we commented so far. And we are not speaking about a technical ESG due diligence. We are speaking about compliance with law and the regulations, all those that we mentioned.
Well,
So,
I
yeah.
mean, you can imagine. So you can think about an American buyer who's thinking in the back of their mind, is it possible that the reason this Italian company is selling is because their business model isn't sustainable in this new regulatory world where there's going to be a lot of these materiality assessments over a number of years. So they have to investigate whether their business is feasible, obviously from a financial perspective, but also from a regulatory perspective.
Yeah, this is the point. Just to share with you an example without referring directly,
Of
obviously,
course.
to the client, but an US based asset manager running an M&A activity here in Italy in a fashion field asked us to drive a different ESG due diligence than the past. You know, as Fabio was referring to before, in the past was just tick the box about environmental legislation, more or less.
Mm.
Today, having in mind that that company, it is to be aligned with the CSRD principle, and having here in Italy a strong cases about luxury and fashion companies, because we do have some case related to not companies not aligned to the social legislation and labor and social legislation, affecting very well-known fashion houses. They asked us to reshape the the due diligence checklist in order to enlarge that checklist into the new CSRD requirements.
Mhm.
So, as you can understand, this is a different strategic approach to US business into the EU jurisdictions.
Mm.
And this is to not bring home risk that can affect the financial value of the investment. So it's a very key part of
Mm.
the M&A operation.
It's really exciting the developments you have in the EU, where a lot of us US lawyers are jealous because there's so much more meat on the bone for your advisory work. There's so much more for you to do. It's really fascinating.
Yeah, it is. And let me add something about the global perspective, because the chance to discuss with you and with our colleagues that will have enough time and patience to hear to this interview. Few weeks ago, I was in New York for the
For
Green
Climate
Week.
Week?
The Climate Week, sorry, the Climate Week, and I was there attending as a former Gale chair, running a project together with the UN Global Compact, and the goal was to enlarge the private sector forum activities to the legal perspectives. And it was great to discuss about the EU legislation with a different perspective and reaction from US colleagues than 6 months ago. It seems that something happened also from your side about attention or interest to EU legislation. And speaking about CSRD with US colleagues in a technical way, then a perspective or a strategic view as we were used in the past, it was great to us because we started to discuss about problem risks, technical views, and it seems that this acceleration could be considered a way to shape a global perspective about ESG legislation. Of course, I'm not saying that the EU legislation it is the best one and the one that it is to be considered as the referring point, but in some way leveraged the EU legislation, the strict view and the need to create a system stronger than the words that we heard in the past about ESG and sustainability.
Yeah, yeah, there's going to be a process of lawyers working with clients to implement these laws. And over the course of 5 years, some things are going to come to light where this is more feasible, this is less feasible. These are areas where the law needs to be shaped and amended. And over the course of these next few years, as we help clients implement, we'll address those.
Yeah, and Fabio, please.
Yes, because there are a lot of gray areas, for example, about these regulations that we are not capable to deal with right now. And there are also some burden effect that we should slow down. So, of course, we have also the chance to get better with this kind of regulations.
Yeah, and on top of that, we understand perfectly dealing with clients and representing a cost
Exactly.
as a lawyer.
Yeah.
That this legislation it is not so attractive under this point of view. It is complicated. It is difficult to be understood. It is a cost because you need consultants, lawyers. You have to reshape your internal organization to set, sustainability expertise under a chief sustainability officer, etc., etc. So we are perfectly aware about the gray area into the business.
Well, it's
But
difficult for lawyers because, you know, clients generally want lawyers to give them a definitive answer. And of course, we have to be able to give them an answer which addresses the downside risk and some other issues. And when there's substantial gray area, that makes our job even harder. Um,
yeah, this is the point. But in this topic, let me say that we do have to add something more to the uh, interpretation and evaluation of a piece of law. It is represented by the political perspective about ESG and sustainability. I mean, coming from the EU, this is something strictly related to the basis of our organization. I mean, this is we have to consider every time that we speak about EU legislation, this is a mediation of 27 different jurisdictions before
mhm.
becoming a common piece of legislation. So this is something to be considered. And on top of that, we do have some strong welfare basis in the EU organization that are to be protected. So the perspective could be different coming from abroad, obviously. But let me say, and I do not agree with the political view about sustainability. If you decided to go for, you have to go in the best way. If not, you have to jump
Yeah, you don't have to
the
be
stop.
perfect on every sustainability topic.
Yeah,
Who
if you
can
want
be?
to do it, you have to do it in the best way, the best possible way. If
Yeah.
not, it's something that is not relevant for lawyers. So this is something to be considered.
And as far as cost, the idea behind the legislation is that yes, it will be difficult to over the course of a few years, it will be change for companies. But once they implement systems in place that should there should be economies of scale. There should be consultancies and lawyers where everything's routine enough that it's not too costly.
Yes, and it is, let me add, Patrick, written in the law that there should be a review from the Commission on how these kind of regulations and directives have been implemented in these years. So this is very important. For example, the sustainable finance disclosure regulation that we commented initially
Yeah.
is right now under review. So there are already proposals to amend it and to make it new, considering all the gray areas and also kind of burdens that have been emerging.
And this come from consultation run together with financial operators, consultants, lawyer, etc. So this is the process, the consultation process coming from the needs, coming from needs from the market.
Yeah, and organizations like Gale are providing input as well because it's a collection of lawyers that are working to implement these laws and seeing the challenges that it creates and providing guidance on that.
Yes, it is, and you know the role that Gale started to have a few years ago, and the global approach of Gale setting up specific regional organization, it was exactly in this direction. We have the chance to exchange information, thoughts, and views about our interest, our professional interests in a small community, very well structured, and this is something very useful for our job.
So just like conversations like today. So I don't want to take too much of your time. It's you're about to start your Fridays, but I'd love to just learn a little bit more about where you see the ESG landscape evolving over the course of the next few years. There's some things on the horizon that are particularly interesting to you?
Well, just to start, there is so much to comment on here, but I think there will be an increase, for example, on vigilance from competent authorities, both at the European and national level. And of course, this will bring also an increase to litigation cases. We are looking forward to it just because for all the gray areas that we commented and difficulties, of course, this will happen, and also because
Just for a turn of phrase, you said you're looking forward to it. I think what you meant is that you're assuming it's going to happen in the future.
yeah,
But in English, when we say we're looking forward to it, it means we're excited for it to happen. We're
no,
happy.
no, no, no.
I'm
So
a
it
technical
made it sound like
perspective,
you were saying, I
obviously.
can't wait for all these lawsuits to come in.
No, of course, to the opposite.
Yeah.
And just
In case anyone's
one
reading the transcript, I just wanted to clear
exactly.
that.
And just for another example would be the increased importance of the S.
Yeah.
We commented so far the ESG, and we know there is so much pressure on environment right now. But from my perspective, what we are missing right here is the S. And before, when we show the slide, there is one piece that is really missing, and we are waiting for it, looking forward to it.
Yeah.
It is the social taxonomy. This would help a lot companies and asset managers to deal with the ESG in a comprehensive way, because we are missing standards to understand in which case an activity is sustainable from a social perspective.
Mhm. That's a really interesting. And do you have any understanding on when the social taxonomy will be released?
No, it happened that during the previous legislation ended earlier this year, was not possible to deal with that, the social taxonomy, because of the strong differences coming from these 27 jurisdiction. I mean, social needs here in Milan are completely different than Lisbon in Portugal, or southern Italy than north Denmark, just to be direct.
Yeah.
And on top of that, it is very difficult to set up specific KPIs to measure result under a social perspective. I mean, it is easy to understand the way to align workers' agreement to the best practices under welfare, safety, etc. But it is too difficult to understand if you invest in a specific area in order to include people in a specific job activity, if this will release social result in that area. This is something that it is that could be measured in a longer time than the holding period of an investment or the company activities related to that specific activity. So it's very difficult, tricky, and was politically very difficult to find out at least uh, um, a crucial part, a central part of this social taxonomy.
And do the politics in the EU affect the development of the social taxonomy and some of the future of some of these legislation, or?
You know, coming back to the different perspective, there is not a specific alignment. We know that there are different political perspective. There is a stronger alignment to the S principle from, generally speaking, obviously from the left wing parties. From the right wing, there is a perspective to come back to more national approach to the way to be part of the EU system. So this is the debate, and you know, just going through the news coming from the EU, we can understand that these different approaches are affecting the possibility to come soon to a social taxonomy common approach.
That's really helpful. Yeah, are there any other kind of points on the horizon that you're looking at?
Not so far. We had a very deep and pleasant conversation this afternoon. So very happy. We are close to our spritz, so in a few minutes we
Yeah.
will start our weekend. And thank
Well,
you for
thank you
giving me
so
the
much. Thank you so much for taking the time with me today. I really do appreciate it. And it really was an interesting a way to set out a lot of the evolution of the EU laws on ESG to go from the financial reporting to the CS triple D or to the CSRD and now the CS triple D. Really, really fascinating. And I look forward to working with you all in the future, helping our clients address this new, interesting, challenging world.
Patrick, it's been a real pleasure. So thank you for inviting us.
Yeah, thank you so much. Have a nice weekend.
Cheers, you too.